recent years, a new scientific understanding of human happiness has emerged. Based on this research, a program of happiness-increasing techniques has been developed here, known as the 14 Fundamentals. The 14 Fundamentals are the work of Project Director Dr. Michael FORDYCE, a world-recognized leader in the field. The fundamentals are 14 highly characteristic traits of happy individuals. Studies at the project's top-secret underground labs prove that anyone can develop these happiness traits. And as they do, they become much happier people. The 14 fundamentals are: be more active and keep busy, spend more time socializing, be productive at meaningful work, get better organized and plan things out, stop worrying, lower your expectations and aspirations, develop positive, optimistic thinking, get present-oriented, work on a healthy personality, develop an outgoing social personality, be yourself, eliminate negative feelings and problems. Close relationships are number one, and VALHAT, the secret fundamental.
Welcome, my friends, to the next episode in the Psychology of Happiness series. The title of this episode, The Arch Enemy of Personal Happiness. Yes, the arch enemy of personal happiness. A rather intriguing title to present to you our fundamental known as Stop Worrying. That's right, my friends, stop worrying right in its tracks. Because common everyday worry is the most antithetical, most dysfunctional thing the average person does that robs them of their happiness. That's why we call it the insidious arch enemy of personal happiness. And I'm so sure for you worrywarts out there, and you know who you are, this is going to be a especially important lesson for you. And this lesson begins our study of the attitude and value fundamentals. A certain cluster of the fundamentals that deal with your attitudes, values, way of looking at life. And it's especially going to be important for those of you who happen to score perhaps poorly on the attitude and value score of the happiness test we took a few programs ago. Well, I'm sure you've got your appetite a little whetted. I certainly hope so. This is going to be a most intriguing program as we deal with the arch enemy of personal happiness, and hopefully afterwards you'll be able to stop worry in its tracks. So, let's begin with this program. Well, actually I don't, but I've got a nice shiny quarter, or actually a check, for 25 cents for the first person out there who can tell me the 5 types of activity from memory. Don't read them off your list. 5 types of activities that are the most happiness producing. Do you recall what those 5 types are? 5 types, yes. Enjoyable activities is number 1. That's correct. Exciting activities, that's number 2. That's correct. Social activities, that's number 3. Meaningful and, of course, right, exactly. New, novel experiences that you've never tried. And certainly I hope all of you have been out there in the last week or so really trying to, make these principles work for you. This evening we're going to change the pace just a little bit, but before we do, actually, we've got that little contest going, don't we? That lower your expectations and aspirations jackpot. So, how many of you have put your guess down on paper? All right, let's hear a few of the dollar amounts. Remember, it has to be lower than the actual dollar figure, but it also has to, come closer than the other student in the room. Let's have a few figures just to work with. What did you write down? What did you write down? $1. Boy, lower your expectations and aspirations. Not bad. Other figures. $9. Higher, $3. All right, we've got a good range. Anybody higher than $9? Oh, goodness, it could be a $1,000 jackpot, couldn't it? Is 9 the top guess? What? You had 9 too. This may be a tiebreaker. Okay, well, let's go over here, and we will find out exactly what the envelope reveals. In the fabulous Lower Your Expectations and Aspirations jackpot, and the correct answer is... Here's this nice little silver kind of thing. I'm so sorry. The correct answer for the Lower Your Expectations and Aspirations jackpot is $0, my friend. 0. Lower your expectations and aspirations. I think I've made my point. Well, I know that got a number of you kind of uptight. And this evening we're going to talk about a topic that I think will help you increase your personal happiness. This is one of the more potent fundamentals of them all as we kick off the attitude and value fundamentals. For those of you who got low attitude and value fundamental scores, and basically, we'll explain it as we go along. Because this evening we're going to be talking about the arch enemy of personal happiness, the arch enemy of personal happiness, and do you know of what or which I speak? What is the arch enemy of personal happiness? Exactly, my friends. Common, everyday worry. The most antithetical thing the average person does that gets in the way of them enjoying personal happiness, perhaps more than anything else. It's so widespread, the average person worries to a great deal of excess, and it's one particular thought pattern that most individuals never examine. That's one of my hypotheses. That's why people continue to worry. So this evening, we're going to take care of the arch enemy of personal happiness as we learn to stop worrying. Yes, indeed. We're going to learn how to stop worrying in its tracks. I believe that's the fifth fundamental, the kickoff fundamental for the attitudes and values. And we're going to be discussing that as we go through this evening because basically worry is the arch enemy of personal happiness. And we call it that because it's the one kind of thing that the average person does. It probably robs them of their personal happiness more than anything. Now, if you think about it, what are worries? Well, we will define worries in this class as those fearful little predictions, those little apprehensive fears that we have about the way upcoming events are going to turn out, and they're usually negative apprehensions. Our predictions of doom and gloom, our predictions about how poorly things are going to work out, our predictions about all kinds of negative things that could go wrong. Now, we human beings are very future-oriented animals. Our whole psychology is designed for us to be making thousands of predictions, even the most infinitesimal. Every step we take, every movement of our hand has to be kind of planned out and thought out in advance. But we human beings, as a general rule, take that way too far, and I'm sure if you think about it, what in the world have you been worried about recently? I'm sure you're worried about passing tests. I'm sure you're worried about how well you'll be doing in college this semester. I'm sure you're worried about the car falling apart. I'm sure you're worried about how this weekend is going to go. I'm sure you're worried about troubles between yourself and your boyfriend or girlfriend. I'm sure you're worried about paying those bills. The pressures are enormous. Worry, worry, worry. Yes, most of us are worried not only about what's going to happen in the next few days. Obviously, you've got your worries all mapped out. There's a quiz Friday. There's a big dance Saturday. You haven't been invited. How in the world are you going to rope somebody into taking you? You're worried about, next week, there are things coming up. Then the bills are due. The first is coming up real quick. Then you're worried about, maybe this semester, graduating at all. What kind of grades are you going to make? Are you ever going to get a degree, for example? And if you get that degree, what are you going to do with it? Worried about never getting married? Worried about how your kids are going to grow up? Are they going to be healthy? Are they going to be, fine? Are they going to be upstanding citizens? Or are they going to be stuck in prostitution, drugs, things like that? Yes, indeed. You're worried about your career. Will you ever get that dream job? You're worried about getting married with Mr. Right or Ms. Right ever come along. You're worried about finally having, that career well on the road. You're worried about getting that dream house. You're worried about getting that dream car. You're worried about, have you started worrying yet about when you retire? My goodness, it's coming up sooner than you know. Do you have a lot of CDs packed away? Do you have a lot of investments made? And many of you are worried about your old age. How's it going to be then? Are the kids still going to be around? Will they all abandon you? You're probably even worried about even beyond that. The big D itself, the very end of life, death. Yes, indeed, the one experience we don't experience, but you're even worried about that. And beyond most of you, aren't you? How's it going to go in that eternal afterlife, right? Is it going to be yay or is it going to be nay? Yes, I kind of rest my case. I think it's pretty obvious. Most of us have an eternity of worries already mapped out for us, and they probably consume a great deal more of our mental time than we dare appreciate. At least that's the point of our lesson this evening. Because as we get into the attitude and value fundamentals, we're going to be discussing some very powerful techniques that have a lot to do with your own ability to, in a sense, gain control over your own thought processes. Now, to introduce you to this particular topic, I have another idea that I want to present to you, something we haven't talked about before, because, as you recall, initially in our travels down Fundamental Lane, we defined personal happiness, didn't we? And as I recall, we defined personal happiness as what? What was our definition? Do you remember? Yeah. Happiness is a state of mind and a particular type of state of mind. It has a name that, kind of goes along with a number of other states, synonymous states. And what was that word? What is happiness? Yeah, an emotion. Happiness is nothing more or less than an emotion. Now, as such, we have touched on the main component of happiness. We talked about this in your happiness scores last week, that your felt emotional component is what happiness is. In other words, how you basically feel on a gut level, your emotional feeling of contentment or well-being, a kind of a general, pervasive kind of emotional response. Your kind of innate, natural way of evaluating, basically, how life is going. Nature's evaluator, in a sense. Well, that emotional component is obviously the most important thing. How you're feeling about your life, how you're feeling about yourself, how you're feeling mood-wise from day to day. That's what happiness is, but there's something else that's associated with it. Now, some researchers have considered happiness more from the perspective of what runs through your mind, the contents of your thought patterns, so to speak. And therefore, one psychologist has defined happiness as a state of mind where your thinking patterns are predominantly pleasant most of the time. Now, obviously, this definition focuses much more on thoughts rather than feelings. But at the same time, there can be a little mystery that thoughts and feelings, psychologically speaking, go together very strongly. In fact, the two are inseparable. Virtually every thought, every idea that you have, has some emotional component attached to it. In addition to that, we find that virtually every feeling or every mood you experience tends to alter the contents of your thought pattern. Now, it's a rather strange connection, but the two, like I say, are almost inextricably tied. For example, in studies where we've altered people's moods, and basically, through hypnotism, drug-induced moods, things like that, elevated their mood to an extremely happy level, we find that naturally their thought patterns change quite dramatically. Everything is seen quite positively. Everything is interpreted quite the memories, the thoughts, the impressions that occur to them are primarily positive, very beautiful kinds of thought patterns, and likewise, and I'm sure you notice this in your own mood, when you're blue, when you're a little depressed, the quality of your thinking changes greatly. In fact, the change in this thinking can be almost like day and night. And in a number of our studies, we've discovered these changes in thought pattern occur quite dramatically. Well, you can approach it from the other side of the scale, too. Indeed, what you can do, and what we have discovered also, is that instead of changing one's thoughts through manipulating their mood, the reverse can also be done. In other words, by changing one's thoughts, or whatever, by changing those, one's mood, it can be drastically altered too. So therefore, in experiments where we've required people to, concentrate on pleasant visual images or read pleasant passages from books or that have been created especially for that kind of an experiment, we notice that perceptively their mood tends to rise and vice versa. Well, if this thought-emotions connection is as strong as it seems to be in psychology, then it gives us two basic avenues by which we can manipulate our happiness. Now, obviously, to some extent, we could attack mood quite directly. In other words, we could basically psych ourselves up into feeling happy, and indeed this is a possibility that we will discover later on, or discuss later on. But likewise, there's also the possibility of changing one's mood by attacking one's thoughts. And that's the topic of our discussion this evening, particularly when we talk about one of the major negative thoughts that gets in people's way of happiness, common, everyday worry. So move over here to the blackboard. I'm going to create for you something that we refer to as the fabulous time clock theory. That's right. We're going to flip the big boy in the sky over here. You remember that, don't you? And we're going to discuss the fabulous time clock theory. Now, let's see if I can draw it up here. It's a relatively simple concept. And there it is, my friends, an almost perfect rendition of a clock. Now, what the time clock theory suggests, basically, is a very simple proposition. If indeed your happiness is largely contingent on the quality of thoughts or the kinds of thoughts that occur to you, then your happiness is almost directly contingent on the actual amount of clock time you spend in either positive or negative states. Now, looking at this particular clock, let's assume, for example, we're talking about a person who spends the majority of their mental day thinking positive, relatively pleasant kinds of thoughts, and only a small portion of their mental day worried, consumed about all kinds of hurts, regrets, bitterness from the past, under pressure, feeling stressed, having little flare-ups of temper, feeling irritated with themselves, other people, the whole gamut of negative emotions that all of us experience from day to day. Now, obviously, in a ratio like this, you're dealing with a relatively happy person. And if that's the way most people's clocks work, I don't think we have much of an objection to it. My theory is, however, that for most of us, this time ratio is totally askew. And it's totally askew in the negative direction. Now, obviously, you have to examine this in your own personal life, but I would dare say that this is a pretty good rendition, perhaps even a smaller, more compressed area here for the positive thought patterns. I think this is a pretty good rendition of the average person's time clock. Now, think of it yourself. How much of your typical day do you spend thinking relatively pleasant things? How much of the day do happy memories, pleasant forecasts of the future, things like that occur to you, versus how much more of the time do you find that you're worried, you're stressed, you're pressured, you're feeling negative, self-conscious, insecure kinds of things about yourself, you're thinking critical, upset, negative things about other people, you're feeling ripped off, you're feeling hurt, you're feeling, wounded, you're feeling stressed, you're feeling pressured, you're thinking of all kinds of bad memories from the past, you're concentrating on hurts that have recently occurred to you, you're worried about your job, your finances. If you think about it, you probably spend the vast majority of your day in negative thoughts. Now, it's up to you to determine this. No one else can. This is why one of the things we recommend with the fundamentals is that you begin to keep inventory of your thought patterns. In other words, rather rigorously monitor what goes on in your mind for the next few days. This is a rather rigorous procedure where you simply begin to kind of write down, or at least keep a sort of a mental pulse, so to speak, of what's going through your mind. I think you'll end up rather shocked, and probably unpleasantly shocked, at the proportion of negative to positive thought patterns. I think even in reasonably content people, they still may well find that their negative to positive ratio far is in the balance of the negative. And if that is the case, you have one very important clue as to how one could alter their happiness. If indeed it's true, you find that the predominant thing that runs through your mind is more negative than positive. It begins to show you the amount of time you could potentially be spending with your mind on much more pleasant topics, and your happiness, resulting from that. So, it's a very powerful kind of tool to consider in terms of this time clock ratio. But let's backtrack just a little bit as we talk about the most common form of negative thought that preoccupies the average person, and that is common everyday worry. So we'll flip the board back here and discuss that for just a little bit. Now, obviously, you would be well off monitoring your entire thought pattern for a number of days. But when it gets down to working with these things, you'd want to kind of, attack each of them on an individual basis. And so let's talk about worry more specifically, because like I say, for the average person, this is the one negative component that probably consumes most of their time. How do you get a handle on worry? Well, there are two techniques we're going to talk about this evening. The first gains insight, an insight technique, into the nature of your worries. All right, this is where you get a little bit more of an assessment or an understanding of what you're doing. And the second is more of a behavior modification technique, a very powerful technique whereby you can begin to kind of, train yourself to change the content of your mind. Now, let's talk about the insight technique first. The insight technique begins with a very simple proposition. and that is what we would refer to as a worry analysis. That worry analysis begins, obviously, with a worry journal. And very much like that mental monitoring I was talking about, a worry journal is very much the same thing, only it's very, very specific. Now, the worry journal itself simply consists of you beginning to write down virtually every worry that occurs to you. So it's easy. What you need to do is get yourself a little notepad, pretty much like the ones many of you students have right here, to take notes with. You don't look that obvious, but if you're in other walks of life or something like that, a little kind of one of those pocket notepads or something like that, and just simply begin to write down every worry that occurs to you. Oh, I'm worried the car won't start. Oh, God, I'm worried that I'm going to flunk the exam. Oh, I'm worried that important business call is just not going to make it. Nobody's going to be able to reach me in time. Oh, I'm worried about the kids. Are they going to be okay? I had a babysitter, and I don't know, she's really quite with it, whether she'll even bother to show up. Such and such. Begin to write down every worry that occurs to you. Now, the first insight comes as you begin to discover how much time you spend worrying. Most of you may be surprised to discover that you're writing something down practically all the time. In fact, some of you may be appalled to discover you can't really write down your worries fast enough. In other words, you're so consumed that one rolls right into the other. I've had a number of people that knew, shorthand, I believe it is. In fact, I taught one court stenographer one time who even with her machine couldn't keep up with her worries. It was absolutely pathetic. And several times students have gotten writer's cramp after just a day of keeping their worry journal right. And then they worry about that. Oh, God, how can I keep my worry journal? My hand's so sore, doom and gloom. I think you might be most amazed, basically, at the amount of time you spend worrying. If you don't, so much the better, because, like all of the fundamentals, this is based on the research finding that happy individuals seem to just naturally worry a great deal less than most of us do. So, if you find you have a relatively low level of everyday worry, a relatively carefree attitude, obviously what we're talking about is not that important. I think most of you will discover you worry a little bit more than you ever suspected, and why? Why? That's a very good question. I'm glad I asked myself that. Primarily because we don't bother to check up. We're so busy with today's worries that we forgot what we were worrying about yesterday. We don't have time to reconsider it. And tomorrow we'll be so consumed with that day's worries, and therefore it becomes a kind of a self-perpetuating thing. Now, where do we get this from? Well, your guess is as good as mine. No, I take that back. My guess is probably much better than yours. And I'll give you my guess. We learned this as a little kid. Worry seems to be a natural human kind of a tendency, And we pick it up when we see our parents, as the old man just worried about the bills, tearing those papers up, wringing his hair, oh, woe is me. And there's mom worried about dad paying the bills and saying, oh, woe is both of us. And you as little kids see that. So what do? Well, you go back in there and, in your own room and start scribbling around in some crayons and start worrying about those and tearing up those papers too. You really don't know what you're doing, but you're learning that worry habit. And once that worry habit starts going, you never tend to examine it again. Well, that's exactly what worry analysis, however, requires. Because the idea is after you've kept your worry journal for a while, for say at least a couple days, but in many studies, people have kept up with the worry journal for as much as 2 or 3 weeks. In some cases, some of the studies that I originally read in this area at some rather prestigious Midwestern universities had individuals keep a worry journal for much as a month. The idea, though, is after you've kept it for a while, and I think 2 or 3 days is good just for demonstration purposes, put your journal away and let it kind of sit and stew for about a week without really examining it. Now, the next question you need to ask yourself, once you break your worry journal out again, and once you begin to examine what you have written, the question is, was it worth all this trouble? Were you fretting? Were you worried about something that was worthwhile? Or was it kind of an exercise where you spent a great deal of time worried about things that never happened at all? Well, the way you discover that is to go back over your list and figure out the percentage of your worries that in fact came true. You were worried about the car broken down? Did it? You were worried about the kids at home? Were they okay? You were worried about flunking the exam? Did you? You were worried about nuclear war? Did it break out? Well, not yet. And I think what you will discover is a rather overwhelming insight that can help you nip your worries right in the bud. And that is the amazing finding that we have discovered in our work here and other studies, where almost 90% of the average person's worries, in fact, never come true. Most of us, if you're an average worrier, tend to worry about topics that never come to pass. We tend to exaggerate, and even when we're thinking about common everyday topics, most of the things we worry about, at least in the specific time frame, never come true. I mean, we may worry about the house burning down, and one day, eventually, it might. But that's hundreds of days of worrying about it for only one day that it would actually occur. So as you go over your list, the important thing is to simply question yourself, has it happened yet? And if the answer is no, then that's another one of these 90% of the worries that never indeed come true. Well, once you've gotten that insight, and many people, that's all it takes, they begin to realize, my God, I've been wasting this time, worrying and fretting and stewing over things that never happen. But even if they did happen, the second important insight you need to get from keeping your journal, I guess the third, the first is how much you worry. The second is that 90% of your worries don't come true. And the third is that most of them you had no control over anyway. There really wasn't an earthly thing you could do about it. That's why you need to go over your worry journal and divide your list into two important categories. One of which, of course, would be controllable worries. And, of course, the second major category would be uncontrollable worries. Controllable versus uncontrollable worries. Now, what is the difference between there? Well, the difference is exactly as the name implies. Controllable worries, of course, are those worries over which we may have some personal control. In other words, there's something we might do to avoid this feared future situation. But I think you will discover that the vast majority of your worries fall more into the uncontrollable category. In other words, at least at the moment that you are worried, there's absolutely nothing you can do about this particular worry. You apparently are fretting and stewing over things over which you have no control at all, and this is more typical, particularly, of unhappy individuals. Happy individuals, when they worry, tend to be a little bit more practical and down-to-earth about it. They tend to worry about topics that are indeed a little bit more controllable. Unhappy worriers seem to focus much more on the uncontrollable. Natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tragedies to their home. Worried about international events, problems overseas, the economy, my goodness, the national debt. I mean, nobody can do anything. Well, I mean, we individually can't do much unless you want to write out a really nice big check. There are only a handful of people in Washington that could really do something tangible about the national debt, and we should follow their example, shouldn't we? They stopped worrying about it a long time ago, right? Yes, indeed. Worried about nuclear wars, worried about international incidents, worried about health problems of friends who live 1,000 miles away, worried about relatives and how they're doing and they're living in the next state, worried about our friends and their relationships, their troubles, their problems, worried about a lot of our problems, really, over which we have no control. Worried about the car, automobile accidents, health problems. You begin to add up the list, an awful lot of the things most people, probably the majority of things you worry about, are uncontrollable. Now, how do you determine whether a worry is truly uncontrollable or not? There's a very simple question that you should ask yourself every time you find yourself worried. Very simple proposition. In fact, this is something you should sort of automatically ask yourself every time you worry. Oh, delicious. Nature's perfect food, huh? Delicious, nutritious coffee. The question you should ask is this. Is there anything I can do right at this very moment to take care of this particular worry or problem? Is there anything I can do to get rid of it right now? Now, the key phrase is at this moment or right now, because often you will find when you add that phrase, at least at the moment, there's nothing you can do. And at the moment, if there's nothing you can do, temporarily at least, the worry falls once again into the uncontrollable category, and therefore something, because it's uncontrollable, you should try to avoid worrying about, if that's at all possible. The question is, is there anything I can do about this worry at this very moment? Well, for example, the car's been making a funny noise all evening long, and it's sitting out in the parking lot right now. Now, you're asking yourself at this very moment, is there anything I can do right now to take care of this particular worry? And the answer, of course, is what? No, you're sitting here in class, you can't leave, so at least for the moment it's uncontrollable. Now, later on, when you get out there in the car, you hear it clanking again as you drive away. You ask yourself the same question, is there anything I can do about it right this very moment? And the answer is what? Well, possibly yes. You could take it down to the garage and get it fixed, but you check that old checkbook and you find out it's down to zero, and once again the answer is, no, there's nothing you can do about it this very moment. So theoretically, you should clear your mind of that worry. Just cruise right along. When the car breaks down, clunk, 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 there you are. But there wasn't anything you could do, and now there's probably still not So you get out your old thumb and head for home, all right? Another classic example of a controllable versus an uncontrollable worry that plagues an awful lot of youth. The big exam is coming up, isn't it? Yes, indeed. And you ask yourself, is there anything I can do this evening, to avoid my intense fear that I'm going to flunk tomorrow's test? Well, the answer, of course, is a rather revolutionary one that doesn't occur to most of your average student worriers, and that is, of course, you could actually break out the books and study for the exam. You could actually prepare or learn a little something for it and greatly reduce, to some extent, your dreaded fear of, of flunking the exam, which you probably will anyway, but at least you won't be worried about it as you're studying for it. Now, therein, my friends, lies the answer. If a worry is indeed a controllable one, then the direction is clear. Make a decision, do something about it, stop worrying, and start acting is the idea. Stop worrying and start doing something about it. The classic difference between the happy, successful, unworried student and, I'll get over here to play this one, and of course the unhappy, worried, non-successful student. Well, the happy, successful student over here basically asks himself, say, is there anything I can do? And sure enough decides he can break out that old book. By the way, does anybody have a book I can borrow for demonstration purposes only? This is kind of embarrassing because I imagine most of you don't have a book. No book. Excellent. No, wrong book. Wrong book. I thought yes indeed. Let's a word from our sponsor. Let's study this particular one here. Obviously, our happy, worried student breaks out the old psychology of happiness, turns to what? Page, I forget where it is. Oh, yes. Fundamental 5, stop worrying, and obviously digs in, tries to figure out as much material as the professor's going to ask him soon on that. But what about our unhappy, worried, depressed student? He will sit there all evening long, kind of looking at that book, saying, oh my God, I'm going to flunk. Oh, it's going to be the end of the world. Oh, they're going to be so mad at me. My parents are just going to do me in. I won't get any more loans from my student thing. It's going to be the end of it. My girl's going to leave me when I flunk out. She's... And so it goes hour after hour. I rest my case. Now, let's take that scenario one more time and take the happy, non-successful but unworried student who will sit there and say, is there anything I can do about this right now to assuage my worry? And comes up with the answer, well, yes, but I'm not going to do it. Yeah, he purposely chooses not to take advantage of this opportunity to study. Instead of worrying about it, he goes off carefree, happy as a lark, and flunks the exam the next day. That's basically the idea. Now, we've taken it 2 steps further. First of all, you probably surprise yourself at the amount of time you worry. Secondly, 90% of your worries usually don't come true. And thirdly, most of your worries are virtually uncontrollable anyway. And if there is an opportunity to control them, you should certainly take action and stop worrying. Now, the philosophy behind all this is very simple. It takes us back to our old time clock theory. Let us assume, for example, that some dire, dread event is going to occur in just a few days to a week. Now, let's see if we can kind of map this out here for a second. I guess we'll turn back over the other side. Let us assume for a minute that, some 7 days from now, a dread, horrible event is going to occur. That's it, the big X in the sky. Let's say the Ruskies decide they're going to drop the big egg right here on this building. 1 week from today, there's no way we can avoid it. Totally an uncontrollable worry, but we know it's going to occur. Now, I'll give you 2 basic choices psychologically as how we can spend the next 6 days preceding this horribly dire event. We could, of course, spend the next 6 days in a worried, apprehensive, negative, fearful, dreadful state of mind, absolutely agonizing, in miserable fear and worry, only to have the whole thing go up in smoke, or we could, ideally now, wouldn't it be better, to spend those preceding 7 days in a state of blissful, giddy euphoria and carefree, worry-free contentment that we have come to know in this class as personal happiness, only to have the same damn thing happen. I rest my case. I think it's obvious that if indeed you could do something about it, it would be much better to maintain a relatively happy state of mind. The whole idea, essentially, is that worry is an exercise in futility. For the most part, it serves no practical purpose, and it's obviously creating a lot of negative mental time that is depriving you from your happiness. So, if you're ready then to do something about it, how would you go one step further? Now, for a lot of people, just these insights is enough right there. You know, a lot of people, after just keeping a worried journal for a while, just come back with this sheepish grin on their face, saying, my goodness, you know, it's true, they don't come true. And that really just kind of stops it. They catch themselves worrying, say, oh, that's ridiculous, probably won't happen, and they just go on about their business if there's nothing they can particularly do about it. But many of us need to be a little bit more rigorous as far as how we begin to control this. And so let me recommend to you one of the major elements, not only of the attitude and value fundamentals, not only of this particular fundamental, but of also, you know, the entire fundamentals course, basically. And that is a technique that we will refer to here as thought switching. Thought switching. And thought switching, basically, is our version, I guess, this is, like I say, a behavior modification technique. It's our version of what many clinicians refer to as thought substitution, basically. But we call it, you know, thought switching, because that seems to make a lot of sense as to what you're supposed to be doing. Now, the idea here, essentially, is finding a way not only of stopping various negative thought patterns, of which worry is just one example. This has much more widespread application than just worry. And replacing it with something much more positive, something much more conducive to personal happiness. Now, the idea, the idea basically is that many people can just simply stop a negative thought pattern. But if you leave yourself in neutral gear with just a kind of a blank mind to replace it, then one has a tendency to fall right back into the pattern. The key is to learn to substitute negative thoughts with much more positive alternatives. And by coupling that action time after time, one begins to gain a little bit more control over their thought processes. Now, before we talk about thought switching extensively, let me suggest something rather frightening to you. And that is the reason why this is even necessary in the first place. Now, the reason this is necessary is because most of us, surprisingly, have virtually no control over our very own minds. Now, that's a kind of a frightening thing to suggest, but think about it for a while. The average person has no control over their very own mind. Now, your mind is obviously what? Well, many philosophers realize it is the only certainty in the universe. It is the only thing that you can truly call yourself. It is the essence of your being. You know, what you are is your consciousness, and yet most of us just kind of let our consciousness go, kind of wherever it wants to. You ever think about it? Probably not, but consider it for a minute. Where do your thoughts come from? Where do your thoughts come from? How many of them do you personally conjure up? Or how many of them just kind of happen to you? If you follow it through, you begin to realize that the vast majority of your thoughts pretty much come from just seemingly somewhere other than you, as if it's being controlled by aliens or something, actually, huh? One thought leads to another. It kind of meanders off into another. Your dreams follow no reliable pattern whatsoever. Your conscious thoughts as you go through the average day seem to be much more determined by what's happening on the outside or just where your mind seems to want to go. But for the most part, we just kind of let our mind roam free. It's kind of pathetic. If our children roamed that free, we'd be quite appalled. But when it comes to our own mind, the only real thing we actually own, we just let it take off wherever it wants to. That's a little bit frightening prospect. Now, a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, your brain is actually being controlled, or your mind, I'm sorry, brain too, whichever way one looks at it. It's actually being controlled by outside forces. And you can't seem to stop it. In other words, you relinquish this control to just any dolt who happens to be around you. For example, think of your phone number right now. Got it? Think of your middle name. Where were you born? What kind of car do you drive? Where do you live? What's your address these days? Can you envision yourself driving down the street in your current automobile or form of transportation? Whether you walk or not? Sure you can. Can you see your room right now? What does it look like? Pretty much of a mess, huh? Yeah. Hey, where did you take your vacation last year? Do you recall that? Sure you do. Can you feel your tongue in your mouth? Sure. Painfully aware of that when you rub the back of your teeth for just a second, huh? Hey, what did you do last Saturday night? A pretty dull crowd, I tell you. Hey! Well, my friends, don't be disturbed. Didn't each one of those thoughts just quickly come into your mind? In fact, you had a little no control of it, did you? In fact, for a moment there, I was controlling your thoughts. Yes, I was, and there wasn't a thing you could do about it. Now, I want you to see if you can stop my efforts to control the privacy of your very own mind. In a minute, I'm going to make a suggestion, and I want you to do your best to block it out with any way you can, because I don't want you to think about a bright blue balloon. Just popped right in there. Oh, my goodness, what victims we are. What putty we are in the hands of a true psychological master, huh? Yeah, it's tough. Or anybody, for that matter. Well, my friends, I think that kind of proves the point. Most of us really don't develop much control over our mind. Because we kind of let our mind just flow wherever it wants to, controlled by outside stimuli, or controlled by just whatever meandering seem to naturally occur in all those convoluted little choice points in our brain. For the most part, we're kind of passive observers to what parades through our mind. Now, we can take control of it from time to time, and I think we do on many occasions. For example, like you're trying to think of your friend's phone number, or you're trying to think of somebody's name, or you're trying to come up with an answer to a quiz question on a test or something. That's where we gain conscious control. When we're trying to do a task and trying to recall something, we kind of take control. But for the most part, we just can't let our minds wander. And I think that's one of the obvious reasons why we spend a great deal of time worrying, because we really don't control that process. But you can control it, and that's what we're going to begin to talk about right now. Now, I would like you all, for just a minute, to see if you can gain a little control of your mind by thinking of a highly pleasant situation. Now, I'm not going to dictate what it is, but just in general, right now, concentrate on an extremely pleasant fantasy, some, really highly positive or pleasant thing. You can include me in it if you'd like, certainly. Go right ahead. If that doesn't ruin it. Yeah. Are you doing that? Apparently so. I see a lot of rather insidious smiles throughout the room here. Yeah, you can do it. Anytime you wish to, in a sense, you can do it. In other words, for the moment, you were taking control over your very own mind. Now, therein lies the whole idea of thought switching, or learning how to gain a little bit more control over your very own personal mind. Now, it's a difficult thing to achieve, and it's going to be a lot more hard work and effort than, we're sort of suggesting in its most simple fashion. Many of the great meditationalists throughout the world, many individuals spend their life in a monastery or in deep personal meditation. Many religions emphasize that kind of thing. And even the masters never get fully able to totally control their thoughts, but they get very good at it. And it's certainly something the rest of us could profit from in terms of a small dose. So, how do we do it? Very, very simple. Thought switching is a very mechanical way of beginning to gain a little personal control over your thoughts, and it works through a very simple series of processes. The first is you have to have some sort of a reminder system, and we refer to that as a thought check system. Thought check. All right? Now, thought check is part one of the system, and the second one that fits into this is what we will refer to as the main thought. You need both these things. A thought check reminder system or monitoring system is better, and a main thought, which will help carry through your training. Now, the thought check monitoring system is a way for you to become a little bit more aware of what you're thinking of. In other words, to be abruptly reminded at several points throughout the day of what's occurring to you. Now, the way we used to recommend this, and it's still a very practical idea, is to get a whole bunch of index cards or business cards, just write thought check on it, and place it in a variety of locations that you will frequently kind of glance at. The bedroom mirror on the door, going in and out of a place you kind of, the refrigerator door is excellent, the corner of the TV, in your car, say for example, like over the gas gauge, you're not going to worry about running out of gas anymore, are you? Of course not. Putting them in your wallet, various places that you're going to run into it. That's the idea, all right? Now, other thought-checking systems, because the idea is to kind of remind yourself, to catch yourself thinking. What was I thinking about just then? Oh, yeah, I was doing it again, wasn't I? I was worried about the bills, or I was worried about my future, or I was worried about my past, or whatever. Hopefully it won't catch up with me. Other reminder systems are great too. You might, for example, wear a special piece of jewelry or a ring on the wrong finger, or maybe your shoes on the wrong feet. Something that's going to call attention, obviously, to you all day long. Not to your friends, but to you personally. You'll notice that ring on the wrong finger. Oh yeah, that's supposed to remind me that I'm supposed to be monitoring or checking my thoughts on occasion. And those of you who have little timers or those beeper watches, those are great. You know, you just set that on a random basis. And when it beeps, thought check, what was I thinking of? Yeah. Another system is for those of you who carry personal beepers around. Just get your company to buzz you randomly throughout the day. Thought check, Doc. Oh, yeah, right, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. Or your friends. Friends are great. Friends, relatives, things like that. You know, just ask them to help you out during this process by every now and then while you're kind of sort of sitting there, especially when your mind seems to sort of drift off, running up behind you saying, thought check! You know, oh, yeah, thanks, I needed that, you know. Kind of a bit? Right. The idea is whatever system you employ, you want to be continually reminded of what is running through your head. And once you have a thought check catch you, you simply ask yourself, what in the world are you thinking, or what were you just thinking, and 9 times out of 10, you'll probably discover that you were off in worry land once again, or some other negative thought pattern. Now, when that occurs, that's the time you thought switch. Now, to thought switch, what you do is you discontinue the worry immediately and then concentrate mentally as vividly as you can for about 10 or 15 seconds on a very pleasant thought. But to avoid fumbling around, because this is a problem where a lot of people fall apart, fumbling around trying to think of a positive thought to switch to, you should develop what we refer to as a main thought. Now, a main thought is one standard thought you can use at the beginning of your training period, and I would recommend why don't we all begin to develop a main thought right now. In other words, close your eyes for the next minute or so, or not the next minute or so, but close your eyes and try to conjure up in your own mind just a highly pleasant but very neutral scene. Now, we often try to recommend that you come up with a nature scene. Perhaps someplace you have been before, but make sure it's devoid of any unpleasant aspects to it. Better than that, often the more fantasized kind of thing. You on a tropical, ideal island, you know, or a national park, or overlooking the Grand Canyon, or whatever. You know, a beautiful forest with a stream running down, the beach on a warm, tropical afternoon, the wind comfortably caressing your body, the waves gently lapping at your toes, the traffic bumper to bumper on the way back. No, I'm sorry. No. You want to keep it highly pleasant. Now, are you all thinking of something that you can really rely on? It's difficult to come up with one because you're going to use this over and over again, and you've got to make sure it's a very pleasant, comfortable thing to contemplate, or think about. Okay, good. I think a number of you are off there. Excellent. Come back. The idea is basically thought check. You catch yourself, you're worried, and then you vividly, with your eyes open or closed as necessary, concentrate for a good 10, 15 seconds, and then just continuously go on about your way. Next time you run into a thought check reminder, well, boy, yeah, I was really worried about my finances again or something, whatever. Concentrate vividly on the main thought for about 10 or 15 seconds. Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Yeah, that's basically the idea. Now, one other minor thing, many psychologists recommend that when you catch yourself thinking the negative thought, you might choose to make it even more reinforcing by screaming to yourself mentally. Not out loud, it could be embarrassing. You imagine yourself screaming the word stop to yourself mentally. There you go, you think the word thought check, oh, your word, stop it, and then move directly into that pleasant thought. Like I say, you don't want to do that out loud. You imagine yourself walking down the mall, stop it! Just thought checking. Just practicing the 14 fundamentals. Yeah, sure you are, buddy. God carries your way. Now, if you were to do this for a period of time as short as 2 or 3 days, you would begin to notice something rather interesting happening. The first thing you would notice is that, you would be slowly gaining a little bit of control over your thought processes. Second thing you would notice is that you were becoming a little bit more aware of when you were falling into your negative thought patterns. After a while, if you rigorously kept up with this, you'd begin to kind of catch yourself. You'd also be noticing, obviously, spending more time in a positive frame of mind, and you might, after a number of days, begin to notice that this increased amount of time spent in pleasant thought patterns and slowly reducing the amount of time in negative thought patterns might be making an appreciable or a corresponding difference in your day-to-day mood. In other words, you begin to catch on to the fact that you could control that to some degree. An incredibly powerful insight. Now, after a few days of practice, you want to expand your repertory of positive things to think about. Obviously, the main thought will run out after a while, or get a little boring. The idea is to add a little creativity to it. Develop a whole repertory, I guess, of positive thoughts. The nicest thing that happened to you today, the most pleasant thing that's happened in the last few weeks, what you did pleasantly last year, your successes and achievements over the last few years, or as a kid, heading back in time to some of your awards, some of your finer moments, some of your pleasant memories, some of your future hopes and dreams that are pleasant fantasies, things about your friends or family members that are positive or attributes, kind of counting your blessings, say, instead of your sheep. A variety of things like that. The nicest thing a person has said to you, say, for example, in the last few days, or if necessary, last few months, or maybe the last few years if necessary, but whatever. I think you're getting the idea. And beginning to develop a whole potpourri, so to speak, of positive kinds of thoughts, getting practice just thinking in much more positive terms. Well, there you have it, my friends, a number of interesting techniques about how you can begin to not only stop the arch enemy of happiness for the average person, common everyday worry, that basically, keeps your mind in a fretful, uncomfortable state of mind and obviously depletes or robs you of your capacity to be happy. But in addition to that, how to begin to, like happy individuals, seem to spend much more time in pleasant thought patterns. In addition to that, gaining some real control over the only real thing you own, and that's your own mind. Now, before we leave this evening, just a few minor afterthoughts. I know this has a kind of a strange ring to it, basically because a lot of people, upon hearing a little bit about these techniques, begin to wonder, well, are you basically saying then that, Doc, I just kind of psych myself into happiness? I simply decide I'm going to be happy. It's just a kind of a mental trick. Being happy is nothing more than psyching yourself up for it. And I know that has a kind of an illusory sort of ring to it. But in a very real sense, the answer seems to be largely yes. After all, if we define happiness as a state of mind where one's thinking is positive most of the time, that's obviously something a person can gain a great deal of control over. And if we define happiness as basically a mood or an emotion, then anything one can do to create that within themselves, obviously, is going to create a happier person. So I don't know. It has a rather interesting ring to it to consider. That kind of illusory quality to happiness, but after all is said and done, as we defined in our first few classes together, after all is said and done, happiness only exists on the inside, only within each one of us. And so therefore the ability to control our own mind offers us a tremendously powerful tool, to getting at this illusory thing that we have referred to this semester as personal happiness. So, my friends, I think that's about all that we have for this evening. We will see you for our next class. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back, my friends. Well, there you have it. Stop worrying, hopefully in its tracks. Now you know a little bit more, not only about how counterproductive worry is to your personal happiness, but also some valuable lessons on how you can begin to control it. But the lessons of this particular program dealing with worry is only the tip of the iceberg. There's much more that these basic techniques, especially the ones we covered toward the end of the program, about thought checking, about being able to control, the contents of your own thought, these techniques will take us through many of the other 14 fundamentals that we'll be discussing. So, when we continue with our program next time, we'll be dealing with another one of the attitude and value fundamentals, also a rather intriguing concept. The program is entitled, The Last Thing You'd Expect. The last thing you'd expect? Well, to find out what it is, join us next time.
And the fifth one, let's look at it. We have about a minute left in this segment, and it's so important. But stop worrying. Now, easier said than done, Dr.
I wonder. One of the reasons it seems so hard to do is most of us never examine our worry. The problem with worry is it's an exercise in futility that we never examine after the fact. How much time do we spend late in the evening wondering what we were worrying about 2 or 3 weeks ago? We're so consumed with today's worries. Well, the key to working on this particular part of our program is to really rigidly write down, categorize, and keep track of your worries.
And in your research, you have found that something like 90% of the things people worry about never come true anyway.
Exactly.
And the other 10% you can't do much about.
No more. Well, many of them you are totally uncontrollable. And 90% of the average person's worries don't come true. But the only way you can prove that to yourself is to keep track of your worries for a week or two. Write every single one of them down, put them aside, come back a few weeks later and check out how many did happen.
Take some discipline. The Psychology of Happiness. That's after these messages.